You probably think the most dangerous squid of all time is something like the giant squid. Some of you who know a bit more about squidology would probably say the colossal squid. And while we still can't 100% confirm if there's any other squids currently out there as big as these two, it's pretty unanimously agreed upon that these are the deadliest squids of today. Because millions of years ago, there was another giant squid. But the only thing wrong with this one was, you could actually see this squid, because it didn't even live in the deep. This was the only giant squid that ever lived at the surface. This was Tusoteuthis. But giant squids are supposed to be dead at the surface, since they need the pressure to survive. So to understand what was wrong with this squid, let's take a look at why the ones we have today absolutely can't. People usually think of modern giant squids as these unstoppable apex predators. They look like they should rule the ocean. But realistically, they don't. The truth is, modern giant squids only live in the deep ocean because they have to. They're literally just hiding. See, squids have one massive problem. They're completely soft. They don't have bones, they don't have armor, they don't have scales. They're essentially just giant floating tubes of protein. And in the open ocean, being a giant floating tube of protein makes you a free meal. If a modern giant squid tried to swim near the surface today, even if it could survive the pressure, it wouldn't last 5 minutes. Sharks would take chunks out of it, dolphins would harass it, and whales would just effortlessly eat it. A giant squid has absolutely zero ways to stop a large predator from just biting it in half. So their only option is to retreat into the freezing water where most predators simply cannot follow them. They survive by being incredibly hard to find. But this raises a really interesting question. If modern giant squids are forced to hide in the dark just to survive, what would happen if a giant squid couldn't hide? What if a giant cephalopod was forced to live in a sunlit ocean where everything could see it? What would it actually have to look like to survive? To answer that, we have to rewind about 80 million years to the late Cretaceous period. But we aren't just going to any random part of the prehistoric ocean. This is one of the most dangerous bodies of water ever, called the Western Interior Seaway. During the Cretaceous, North America doesn't look like it does today. The sea levels were so high that the entire continent was physically split in half by a giant shallow ocean that ran straight from the Arctic all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This seaway was warm, it was sunlit, and it was completely packed with some of the most ridiculous animals evolution has ever produced. The waters were filled with mosasaurs, which looked like, well, this. There were Cretoxyrhina, also known as the Jinzu shark, which were essentially just great whites scaled up to absolutely absurd proportions. Because apparently, regular great whites just weren't scary enough. Literally everything in this ocean was out for blood. If you took a modern giant squid and dropped it into the Western Interior Seaway, it wouldn't last an hour. It would be instantly torn apart by marine reptiles before it even figured out where it was. So if you're a cephalopod living in this exact ocean, you have a problem. You can't dive deep to hide because the seaway is relatively shallow. You can't rely on the dark because the sun reaches the bottom. If you live in an ocean where literally everything is huge and armored, evolution forces you to do something drastic. You have to become incredibly violent just to avoid going extinct. And that's exactly what happened. For decades, whenever paleontologists talked about Tusoteuthis, it was almost always referred to as the giant squid of the Cretaceous. And it makes sense why. You find a fossil of a massive 30-foot cephalopod with long tentacles, and your brain immediately just goes, okay, giant squid. But recently, scientists took a much closer look at the anatomy of this creature, and they realized something completely wild. Tusoteuthis is actually a vampiromorph. This means it's a heavily scaled up, prehistoric relative of the modern vampire squid. And I know this sounds like a minor technicality, but it actually completely changes how we have to picture this animal. True squids are built for one specific thing: speed. They're basically just designed to jet backward through the water so they can run away. Vampiromorphs don't do that. They're built completely differently. They're much wider, they're thicker, they have broader fins, they're built purely for stability and maneuverability. So right away, we're dealing with a completely different type of animal. A giant cephalopod that didn't rely on just sprinting away from its problems. But being thick and slow and essentially made of delicious squid meat still doesn't sound like a great survival strategy in an ocean full of giant reptiles. So how big was this thing actually? When we talk about the size of Tusoteuthis, the numbers usually put it at around 20 to 30 feet long. At first glance, that sounds slightly smaller than a modern giant squid, which can reach up to 40 feet. But comparing these two animals just by length is a mistake. Length doesn't really matter as much as pure weight. A modern giant squid gets almost all its length from two fragile feeding tentacles. If you take those tentacles away, the actual body of the squid is a lot smaller. It's basically just a long noodle. Yeah, not exactly intimidating. Tusoteuthis didn't have those ridiculously long tentacles. Its 30-foot length was almost entirely made up of dense body mass and thick arms. But the most important difference was what was actually inside the fat. Modern squids have a flexible internal structure called a pen, which is basically just a flimsy piece of cartilage. Tusoteuthis had a gladius. A gladius is a heavily calcified internal shell that ran down the length of the body. This was a rigid spear of bone-like material supporting its entire mantle. This completely changes how the animal actually works. Its body was actually muscled and supported by a massive internal beam. If a predator tried to bite into the main body of a Tusoteuthis, they'd hit the shell, which would make it at least a little bit harder to eat. Still not enough to stop a mosasaur though. And obviously, you don't survive the Cretaceous just by playing defense. You actually have to kill things. If you look at the suckers on a normal squid, they're usually lined with tiny rings of chitin. They use these to grip onto slippery fish so they can pull them in. It works perfectly for catching small, soft prey. But obviously Tusoteuthis didn't live in an ocean full of small, soft prey. It lived in an ocean where even the most basic fish had scales that acted like chainmail. Normal suction cups would be completely useless here. They'd just slide right off. So Tusoteuthis had to upgrade. Instead of just having normal suction cups, the arms of Tusoteuthis had hooks that look like, well, this. This is kinda similar to most of the hooked squids today, but in reality, we aren't 100% sure of what they look like because it's just so hard to gather information about an animal where 99% of it dissolved away a million years ago. So I know what you're thinking. We have a 30-foot vampire squid. But would this actually be able to kill a giant squid? Let's put the modern giant squid up against the Tusoteuthis in a hypothetical fight. And by giant squid, I mean actual giant squid, because I know these are both giant space squids. In a fight, the modern giant squid definitely has the reach advantage. It has those two massive feeding tentacles that can shoot out and strike from a distance. In a fight, the giant squid is absolutely going to land the first hit. It would whip those tentacles out and latch onto the Tusoteuthis. But then what? The giant squid's primary weapon is its suction cups with those little chitin rings. If it grabs onto the Tusoteuthis, it's trying to grip onto a heavily muscled animal supported by a rigid internal bone. The giant squid simply isn't strong enough to break through that. On the other hand, the Tusoteuthis is just heavier. Once the giant squid pulls the Tusoteuthis in close, the fight is immediately over. The Tusoteuthis is using hooks. The giant squid essentially brought suction cups to a knife fight. It would wrap its thicker, heavier arms around the giant squid, dig those hooks directly into the soft, unarmored flesh, and completely overpower it with brute strength. The giant squid is built for hit-and-run tactics in the dark. The Tusoteuthis was built for close-quarters brawling into sunlight. The modern squid might land the first hit, but the Tusoteuthis would easily overpower it just by being heavier and fundamentally harder to kill. But obviously, Tusoteuthis wasn't spending its time fighting modern giant squids. So what was it actually using these weapons on? Tusoteuthis was an aggressive hunter that targeted some of the most formidable prey in the Seaway. We know from the fossil record and the structure of its weapons that it hunted large predatory fish. It hunted other, smaller cephalopods. But most importantly, it likely hunted marine reptiles. Now, it obviously wasn't taking down a fully grown 50-foot mosasaur, but the western interior Seaway was a breeding ground. There were young mosasaurs, small plesiosaurs, and heavily armored sea turtles everywhere. For a 30-foot Tusoteuthis, a juvenile marine reptile is something it could actually kill. It would use its hooks to bypass the reptile's tough skin, pull it in, and use that massive beak to crush its skull or spine. It proves that Tusoteuthis was actively eating animals that would easily hunt us today. But yes, Tusoteuthis was sometimes prey. We need to pull back for a second. Tusoteuthis sounds completely overpowered. It's huge, it's armored, it has hooks, and it eats reptiles. But the Cretaceous ocean didn't care how cool your hooks were. Tusoteuthis was actually regularly hunted, killed, and eaten. We have fossil evidence showing that mosasaurs and giant predatory sharks actively fed on Tusoteuthis, and this is where you really start to understand just how ridiculous the Cretaceous ocean was. If a 30-foot armored squid is considered prey, the things eating it had to be unbelievably dangerous. A fully grown mosasaur didn't care about the armor. It didn't stop and go, "Oh no, hooks." It just saw an easy meal. The mosasaur's jaws were so massive that the armor of the Tusoteuthis didn't even matter. The reptile would just bite down, shatter the internal shell, and swallow the squid in massive chunks. But again, while Tusoteuthis wasn't the highest necessarily, it was definitely a high-level predator in an ocean that was genuinely violent. Don't think it's weak just because it also existed at the same time as some of the strongest animals that ever existed on the planet. And just because you can eat a Tusoteuthis doesn't mean it's actually a good idea. In fact, we have hard proof that trying to eat one could go horribly, horribly wrong. One of the most incredible fossils ever discovered gives us a perfect snapshot of exactly how tough Tusoteuthis really was. Paleontologists unearthed the fossil of a predatory fish called Squid. This was a 15-foot-long fish covered completely in scales with a mouth full of sharp teeth. It was a serious predator in its own right. And inside the throat of this fossilized fish, scientists found something amazing. It was the internal gladius of a Tusoteuthis. Here is exactly what happened. The 15-foot fish saw a juvenile Tusoteuthis and decided it wanted an easy meal. It swam up and swallowed the cephalopod whole, putting it head first into its throat. Normally, when a fish swallows a squid, the squid's soft body just folds up and slides right down into the stomach. But remember, Tusoteuthis isn't soft. The fish swallowed the squid, but the squid's rigid gladius refused to bend. It acted like a solid spear. As the fish tried to force it down, the gladius got completely stuck, and the fish just choked to death. The Tusoteuthis died, obviously, but it took the fish down with it. Kind of a petty revenge, but I'm not about to feel bad for a fish from 80 million years ago. Even when a predator successfully caught one, the Tusoteuthis was so solid and heavily built that it literally choked the fish to death from the inside. They sank to the bottom of the Seaway together and fossilized in that exact position for 80 million years. It's undeniable evidence that Tusoteuthis was structurally built differently than any squid alive today. So if these squids were so structurally sound and so successful, why don't we see them at the beach today? If you look at the ocean right now, every single giant cephalopod lives thousands of feet below the surface. The giant squid, the colossal squid, the big fin squid, they're all restricted to the absolute darkest parts of the abyss. So what happened? Why did the surface-dwelling giants completely disappear? Well, the most obvious answer that usually comes to mind is the asteroid. The same extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs also wiped out the mosasaurs and the giant marine reptiles. You'd think that with all the massive predators gone, a giant squid would absolutely thrive at the surface. But the extinction of the reptiles actually created an even worse problem for the squids. Because when the reptiles died out, a new type of animal took over the ocean. Us. Well, not us, but our distant aquatic cousins. Mammals. Specifically, the ancestors of modern whales and dolphins. And marine mammals brought a completely new hunting strategy to the ocean that squids simply couldn't defend against. When a mosasaur hunted, it basically used its eyes and its speed. If a squid could see the reptile coming, it had a chance to fight back or maneuver away. But whales and dolphins use echolocation. They literally use sound to map out the water around them. You cannot hide from echolocation. And worse, mammals hunt in teams. A mosasaur was a solitary hunter, but a pod of dolphins or early whales would attack as an entire group. If you fight one, you fight all of them. A large squid, no matter how thick its gladius is or how sharp its hooks are, simply cannot compete with animals that actually share information and work together. Armor is great against teeth, but it's completely useless against teamwork. The mammals would use echolocation to strip away the squid's stealth and use their numbers to completely overwhelm it. The squids were literally forced down there. The surface ocean became completely unlivable for giant cephalopods because mammals were just too good at hunting them. The only squids that survived were the ones that retreated so deep into the freezing, high-pressure abyss that mammals simply didn't want to follow them. But what if that never happened? What if the mammals never took over and you were swimming in the ocean today and you actually ran into a Tusoteuthis? Let's imagine a scenario where Tusoteuthis never went extinct. You're a scuba diver exploring a shallow reef off the coast of Florida, and you see a 30-foot shadow moving towards you in sunlit water. If you brought a modern giant squid to the surface right now, it wouldn't even be able to fight you. Its body is adapted to the extreme pressure of the deep sea. The moment it reached the surface, the lack of pressure in the warm water would instantly kill it. If you met one at the surface, you'd be stepping directly into its territory, facing an animal at absolute peak performance. And realistically, you'd have absolutely zero chance. Tusoteuthis evolved to fight heavily armored fish and thick-skinned marine reptiles. Its hooks were designed to pierce through literal bone and scale. To an animal used to fighting a mosasaur, a human in a neoprene wetsuit isn't even a fight. You can't swim fast enough to escape. You don't have any armor to block the hooks. And its crushing beak would snap a human femur in half with absolutely zero effort. You'd be completely trapped in its environment, and it's built to destroy things way tougher than you. Thankfully though, you'll never have to worry about this, because evolution completely humiliated its entire bloodline. You would hope an animal as impressive as a Tusoteuthis would have some modern relative out there keeping the legacy alive. But the reality of what happened to this family tree is actually almost sad. The only surviving member of the vampiromorph family alive today is the modern vampire squid. And despite its incredibly edgy name, the modern vampire squid is pathetic. The modern vampire squid maxes out at around a foot long. It has absolutely zero armor, and its body is completely soft. It doesn't even have sharp hooks anymore. In fact, it doesn't even hunt. To survive the extinction events and the rise of marine mammals, this family of cephalopods had to give up basically everything. Today, the vampire squid lives thousands of feet deep in the oxygen minimum zone, a place so devoid of life that predators don't even bother going there. And instead of hunting, it just floats around in the pitch black, extending a sticky filament to catch marine snow. Marine snow is basically just dead plankton, fish scales, and literal feces that slowly drifts down from the surface. That's the fate of the Tusoteuthis bloodline. The descendants of a 30-foot, armored, reptile-eating tank are now the size of a football, hiding in the dark, eating garbage. Evolution can be incredibly disrespectful. It's a massive fall from grace, which honestly is probably the best possible outcome for us. We spend a lot of time being terrified of the deep ocean. We look at the pitch black water and we imagine all the horrible things that must be hiding down there. But the truth is, the deep ocean is mostly just a refuge. It's a hiding spot for the animals that weren't strong enough, fast enough, or smart enough to survive at the surface. A lot of the real horrors of the ocean aren't hiding in the dark today. They're usually just at the surface in plain sight. And hey, I have a video on those guys too, so you guys should definitely check this out. Also, I wanted to thank you guys for all the support on the channel. I know I don't really ask you guys to subscribe often, so the fact that 150,000 of you guys still did really means a lot. And thank you guys in the comments who have been supporting me through all of this. It can be hard to keep up sometimes, but the support really keeps me going. Anyways, here's that video. See you guys in the next one.